Racism is a multifaceted form of prejudice that influences the way one perceives and acts towards certain groups. Now that you know what racism is, let us discuss the consequences of racism, identify racial discrimination, and learn the necessary elements to develop anti-racist attitudes. Stay with me on this important journey. Let's start by examining the consequences of racism. Education and race. Racial bias and systemic barriers in education present negative issues for racialized people. To illustrate the social consequences of racism, here are some examples from the Canadian Color of Poverty 2019 initiative. Most of the facts reported are taken from data for the Toronto area in the 2016 Canadian Census. There are lower high school graduation rates among Black, 69%, and First Nations, 50% students compared to white students, 84%. Black and First Nation students are less likely than white students to follow an academic pre-university program and more likely to follow an applied program. Black, First Nations, East Mediterranean, and Southwest Asian students are disproportionately represented in school expulsions. For example, Black students represent 2% of the student population, but they account for 48% of expulsions. Low-income students are more likely to fall short of provincial reading expectations compared to their high-income peers. Students from lower-income families are at higher risk of not pursuing university studies. There is a greater police presence in schools with larger populations of Black students and students considered vulnerable or at risk. Income and race. Racialized people, 20.8%, are more likely to have low income compared to white people, 12.2%. The majority, 80%, of First Nations people in Canada living in reserves are below the poverty line. In general, child poverty rates are higher among immigrant children, First Nations children, and non-white children. Immigrants spend more than 50% of their income on housing and experience more food insecurity compared to native-born Canadians. Economic consequences. Systemic racism and racial discrimination impact the employment opportunities and financial situation of those who are victims of it. Among other things, there are discrepancies between the education and employment status of racialized people compared to white people. Employers frequently discriminate against applicants on the basis of their name. With equal skills and qualifications, an employer is less likely to choose a person whose name appears to be of African, Asian, or Arab origin. The non-recognition or devaluation of international credentials means that many immigrants are unable to apply their skills in their chosen field of employment. In Canada, 41% of chronically low-income immigrants have a post-secondary diploma. Employers are also inclined to discriminate on the basis of the applicant's sector of residence. The use of criminal record checks in the hiring process further excludes over-policed groups from employment. Low-wage workers from temporary immigration are disproportionately from the South. Racialized people, First Nations people, and immigrants are overrepresented in part-time jobs with low income and no benefits for absence and job security. In 2015, First Nation employees in Ontario had a lower wage rate of $26 an hour, compared to non-First Nations people who received $27.41 an hour. Mental health impacts. Internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and systemic racism, discrimination, microaggressions, and racial profiling can have lasting impacts on the physical and mental health of racialized people. In particular, they contribute to the development of the following problems: psychological and emotional distress, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive symptoms, low self-esteem, chronic stress, suicide, alcoholism and substance abuse, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, neurological diseases, increase in body mass index. So, the consequences of racism are real and deep. Significant ramifications such as poverty, lack of education, and job insecurity all give rise to a precarious socio-economic foundation from which racialized populations are expected to rise to meet the same challenges as other members of society. Even when racialized individuals reach the same heights as other races in their chosen field of work, the opportunities for advancement are often fewer, and their rate of pay is often lower despite equal competencies. As deeply rooted and prevalent as racism is, this crisis is not without hope of remediation. Let's now look forward to examine what you can do to become anti-racist. How to spot racial discrimination. Here's what to look for. Racial discrimination is any action that limits a person's opportunities because of their race or ethnicity. It can take many forms and is sometimes more easily identified than at other times. Here are some examples of racial discrimination in schools, workplaces, and healthcare services. Academic environment. Using a condescending tone when speaking with a parent who seems uncomfortable speaking the language of the institution. Orienting racialized students towards less rewarding career paths. Having a lower tolerance threshold for actions punishable by school suspension based on race. Having a more severe discipline based on race or disciplining a racialized student while a white student is not disciplined in a similar context. Involving police services in the investigation of racially based allegations against a student. Work environment. Turning a blind eye to racial discrimination in the workplace. The employer has the responsibility to address the problem to both the person responsible for the act or words and the victim. Having a lower tolerance threshold for the dismissal of racialized employees. Having higher requirements for racialized employees. Refusing to hire a racialized candidate because they feel that they do not belong on the team. Establishing hiring criteria that may be disadvantageous to individuals from certain racial or ethnic groups. Giving less favorable treatment to an employee who has made a complaint about a racist occurrence or racial discrimination. Assuming lower skills and/or assigning a lower salary because of race. Health services. Failing to recommend medical discharge to a patient because of race or ethnicity. Talking to a patient or doctor in a condescending tone or putting them down because of their accent. Providing services reluctantly to the patient by making assumptions based on race or ethnicity about the patient. Offering treatment based on assumptions about the patient's financial situation rather than offering the best available treatment. Not giving all the information so that the person is able to anticipate complications. Assessing incompletely leading to late screening. Speaking directly to the interpreter without looking at the patient. Deconstructing racial biases. You need to recognize your own racial biases and prejudices, as well as those communicated by your environment. Here is a list of some examples. Making assumptions about a person's intelligence based on their language level, meaning the language spoken by the majority. Having a preference for daycare centers where the majority of the caregivers are white. Having a sense of immediate danger in the presence of people from certain groups, for example, a woman holding her purse tightly when she passes a black man on the street, or a person who is concerned about the safety of their family when they pass a veiled woman at the airport. Now you know what the problems are. You've seen the severe consequences of racism, and you've heard many examples of how racism can live in any environment.